All right, we are back again. This is Procreation in Human Enhancement. So we're taking some of the main ideas that we've discussed already about enhancement, and we're applying them to the specific case of procreation. So the kind of background thought process here is you're a parent in a near future. You have access to technology that could potentially affect the identity of the kid you have. Perhaps it's in the case that Savulescu is going to talk about. Maybe it's just you're picking embryos for an in vitro fertilization procedure, or maybe it's something more sci-fi where you're already pregnant, but now you have the ability of engaging in some kind of procedure that changes the genetic makeup of your existing child in some way. Either way, it's interesting to think about the extent to which you would be morally obligated under those conditions to select for or against certain traits. So let's get into this. Savulescu's position is based on the principle of procreative beneficence. So here's the principle in its entirety. I've just copied and pasted this right out of the reading, page 415 of the article. Couples or single reproducers should select the child of the possible children they could have, who is expected to have the best life, or at least as good a life as the others, based on the relevant available information. Now, in the abstract, there's nothing about this principle that seems that unusual. You know, if you're a parent, you should prioritize the welfare of your child. That's something that most parents do in their ordinary parenting practices. And if you've got a choice, a variety of different available options, and one of those choices gives your child the best possible life, that seems like the choice you should pick, right? Doesn't seem that wild to think about it that way. Now, let's get a little bit of important terminology out of the way so we can understand the intricacies of Savulescu's position. First, we got to talk about the difference between disease genes and non-disease genes. Here's a disease gene. It's just a gene that causes a genetic disorder or predisposes a person to the development of some genetic disease. A couple of the examples you might think of here: cystic fibrosis, which he talks about in the article, or Tay-Sachs disease. There are plenty of others. In some cases, the gene itself is what causes the illness. In other cases, it just makes the development of a disease more likely. Either way, those are considered disease genes. There is a widespread consensus in medical ethics that when we have the ability to avoid transmitting disease genes, that's something that we should do. Because typically, these diseases radically reduce a person's potential welfare after they're born. Now, non-disease genes are a little bit different. These are genes which cause or predispose a person to some physical or psychological state that's not a disease state. So having a set of genes that makes you very likely to reach a height greater than 6 feet tall, there's nothing disease-worthy about being 6 feet tall or being 5 feet tall or whatever. Those are not disease genes. Similarly, genes that increase or decrease your intelligence or your likelihood of developing certain intellectual aptitudes, unless they're extraordinarily extreme, like if we were talking about, say, an IQ equivalent of like 30, that would probably qualify as some kind of a disorder. Maybe it's unclear exactly where we would draw the line here between what separates like a disease gene or a non-disease gene, but typically we wouldn't say above average intelligence or below average intelligence constitutes a disease. It would only be if it was so extreme that it impaired your most basic functioning. The same thing might be true for height, right? So a person who was literally only like 18 inches tall, that person would be so small that their basic means of getting around in society and doing things, as well as certain aspects of their physiological functioning, would be significantly impaired by them being that small. That might well qualify as some kind of a disease under those conditions. But for our purposes, generally, we're not going to talk about these kinds of borderline cases. But we need to recognize the difference here between diseased genes and non-diseased genes because, again, consensus that we should avoid diseased genes whenever possible. We should select against them. But generally, a lot of people don't think the same is true when it comes to non-diseased genes. You're not obligated, even if you have the means to do so, a lot of people think you're not obligated to select for or against certain non-diseased genes. So, why should we select against disease? Well, Savulescu has a really basic argument for that. He draws on a simple case, which is about asthma. And he argues that prospective parents in an in vitro fertilization scenario should select the embryo that lacks a gene that increases the risk of having asthma if there aren't any other genetic differences between the embryos. So he uses, just the labels embryo A and embryo B. And one of these embryos has no predisposition to asthma. The other embryo is in all relevant respects the same, except it does have a predisposition to asthma. And he thinks in that kind of very, very simplistic case, you should select against asthma. Why? Because asthma reduces a person's quality of life. It's a medical condition. It just makes it harder for you to breathe. It doesn't improve your life in any way. It just makes your life a little bit worse. Not debilitatingly worse, but a little bit worse. So if you got an opportunity to select against it, why wouldn't you select against it as a parent? Now, something I want to point out here before we go further is, think for a minute. Let's go back to this for a second. What moral theory is Savulescu appealing to when he's talking about parental obligations tied to promoting a person's quality of life, in this case, the child's? What do you think? We've talked about 3 in this class: consequentialism, deontology, virtue ethics. Which of these do you think this argument appeals to the most directly? Take a moment to think this over and come up with your best guess, or if you're pretty confident, your best answer. It's consequentialism, right? This is basically a consequentialist argument. The reason to select against disease is to try to promote the best outcome possible for your child. So this kind of reasoning is the same reasoning he's going to apply to non-diseased genes. So just as on consequentialist grounds we select against diseased genes, we're also going to select against non-diseased genes. So it should come as no surprise that just as there are diseased genes that can make a person's life go significantly worse, there are also some non-diseased genes that can make a person's life go significantly worse. So Savulescu thinks we should also select for favorable non-disease genes and against unfavorable ones in the same way that we select against disease genes already. The rationale for doing this in both cases is the same. Certain genes just make it more likely that your child's going to live a good life, and if you're following this principle of procreative beneficence, where you're prioritizing trying to give your child the best possible shot at a good life, this is just what follows. Now, real quick, we need to acknowledge a couple other principles of procreative ethics Savulescu talks about. First one, principle of procreative autonomy, says couples should be free to decide when and how to procreate and what kind of children they have. This is like the common sense moral principle of procreative ethics. This is what most people believe is true. Most people give very wide latitude to parents with respect to their how they raise their children. We don't generally intervene in parents' lives except in perhaps really, really extreme cases of child abuse or neglect. But Savulescu wants to say that this principle and a couple others don't really get us in the right direction with respect to the asthma case, right? So if this principle is the only one that's applicable, then there's no reason to favor or disfavor the asthma gene. It just depends on parental preference. And he thinks that's wrong. There's an obvious moral reason to favor selecting against the asthma gene, because asthma's bad. It makes your child's life go worse. So even if for some weird reason the parents wanted to have a child that had asthma, which would be a very weird thing to desire as a parent, but if that was what they wanted, this principle says that we just have to honor that. That's the end of the story. And Savulescu thinks that that's wrong. The principle of procreative beneficence he thinks is superior. Here's another principle, probably not as well known to some of you. Principle of non-directive counseling. Doctors and genetic counselors should only provide information about risk and options available to reduce that risk. So here's what that means. Doctors could tell you about the risk of your child getting asthma in this kind of case, but they could not take any action to try to affect your choice. They basically just give you information about the risk and information about, hey, embryo B's got this risk of having asthma. You could avoid that risk by selecting embryo A, but that's all they can do. So on this principle, nothing should be done to prevent the parents from choosing an embryo with predisposition to asthma as long as the risk has been disclosed. And he thinks, well, that doesn't seem totally sufficient. I mean, we should probably at least try to persuade the parents, right? Accordingly along the lines of the principle of procreative beneficence, we should at least try to persuade the parents that there are good moral reasons for them to select against the asthma gene. And then there's this last one that he talks about, which is the best interest of the child principle. We should prioritize choices that promote the best interest of the child conceived. Now, here's the thing about this particular principle. It doesn't really... You might think, if you just see this in the abstract, you might think, well, wouldn't that principle also give us a reason to select against asthma? Actually, the way it's worded, it doesn't. It might not be easy to see that, so let me explain why. In this case, you're selecting two different embryos, right? Embryo A and embryo B. So if you pick embryo B, which is the embryo with the asthma, predisposition to asthma, and the child has asthma as they develop, well, there's a sense in which that child would be better if they didn't have asthma. But if you make the choice to pick embryo A, that child that came about via embryo B, that child just doesn't exist. You've simply replaced the embryo B child with the embryo A child. Because you got two different embryos. It's not like these are the same person and they're going to develop in different ways. They're completely independent people, right? And they have completely independent gene sets. There's no scenario where you can pick child B and they get asthma and you can say, oh, well, it would be better if they didn't have asthma. No, their genetics are literally tied to asthma. That's how their genetic constitution is. You can't change a person's genetics without fundamentally changing who they are. So that person was just going to have, if they were going to be born, that person was going to have asthma, no matter what. So on this principle, either choice, embryo A or embryo B, is promoting the interests of that particular child. It's not a super obvious thing to notice, and Savulescu spends a whole 3 sentences explaining this in the paper, but that's the explanation. That's why this principle doesn't work. Doesn't, in his view, get us the right verdict about that asthma case. Now, let's finish our transition from the asthma case to these non-disease genes. There are 3 broad theories of the good life in the history of philosophy. There's hedonism, which says life goes well when it's filled with pleasurable experiences. There's desire fulfillment theories, which say life goes well when your desires are fulfilled. And there are objectiveless views, which say that life goes well when certain objective characteristics of your life are met. Those lists can vary depending on who's presenting them, but some of the things that they typically include would be, for instance, having meaningful work, being free from oppression, being well educated, having a significant amount of autonomy or personal freedom. That's not necessarily the same, by the way, as being free from oppression. There could be overlap there, but you could live in an oppressed society and still have a wide range of autonomy, but still in various ways have infringements on your rights. So think about African Americans living during pre-civil rights era, like in the segregated parts of the country. They may have had a great wide range of autonomy, but there's a very clear sense in which they were oppressed by the background social conditions. There could be plenty of others. There could be some people think that having I think I already mentioned meaningful work. Some people think that having a significant amount of leisure is essential to would make the list. Some people think that having a certain degree, not just being educated, but having a certain amount of just knowledge about the world. The list goes on. It can be very, very robust. Some of the most extensive theorists who have developed these accounts, their lists have been 20, 30 different items long for what counts, what makes your life go well in a certain way. And not all these things are necessarily within your control or even about you specifically. I mean, some of them have to do with your perception of others. Some people think that your life goes better if other people respect you or like you, right? Or if you have a lot of friends. Those things are not always totally under your control. But nevertheless, a lot of people think they can affect how your life goes. Here's why this matters. On any of these theories, according to Savulescu, there are non-disease genes that affect how well your life can go. So, on any of these accounts, certain non-disease genes can impact your life. So here's just one. There are many examples you could list. I'm just giving one that I think is fairly obvious, where one case where all three of these accounts would be affected. So, in other words, one case where whether you're a hedonist, a desire fulfillment theorist, or an objective list theorist, you should agree that having this particular non-disease trait will probably make your life go worse than it otherwise would. And the one I picked was just having low or significantly below average intelligence, something like that. So if you're in that category, it may well make your life less pleasurable because you miss out on the pleasures of certain intellectual pursuits, like reading complex books or writing or engaging in other kinds of intellectually laborious tasks. It may make it harder for you to fulfill your desires because you may have a harder time recognizing solutions to your problems. Your problem-solving skills, if they're below average as a result of this, you may just not be able to make the connection between, okay, here's what I don't like about how my life is going or how this situation's unfolding. Here's a solution that I can implement. You might have a harder time figuring those things out, and that may well make it more difficult for you to fulfill your meaning, the desires that mean the most to you. And lastly, having low intelligence might make it harder for you to fulfill whatever criteria there are in an objective list theory, especially those criteria that involve acquiring knowledge related goods or goods related to learning about the world, or even those goods associated with, say, having meaningful work, or it may be more difficult for you to find a job that you find meaningful and fulfilling if you're constantly being beaten out for that job by people who have a higher innate intelligence than you. The bottom line is certain genes that seem to, certain non-disease genes that make it more likely for you to have low intelligence seem like they're just generally going to be negatives for your life. They're very likely to make your life go worse than it otherwise would. So here's the upshot of this from Savulescu's point of view. Just as we select against certain genes that cause debilitating, sometimes life-threatening diseases, we should also select against genes that negatively impact a person's life in other ways. So that means in the particular case I just examined, we should select for genes that improve a person's intelligence, or are at least likely to improve a person's intelligence, and we should select against genes that are less likely to promote intelligence, genes that correlate with lower intelligence. Those genes should be selected against. The thought is, if we do this, then the child's life will, at least in most circumstances, go better than it otherwise would. Now, Savulescu considers a few objections to his general proposal. One concern is that this type of selection may harm the child by creating excessive parental expectations. So the thought here is, if you're a parent and you're designing your kid to be super intelligent or be really tall or more muscular than the average person or whatever, then you're going to have expectations that that child engage in certain kinds of activities and have more success than the average child does. That can be harmful for the child because, they'll be burdened by parental expectation, but also because they may be forced into or pressured into certain paths, certain activities by their parents that they wouldn't have chosen for themselves if they had a say in the matter. So Savulescu has two main responses to this. The first one is, he says, there are ways to reduce excessive parental expectations. The main example he gives is counseling. He thinks, excessive parental expectation is not unique to human enhancement type cases or genetic selection type cases. It happens all the time. There are ways to reduce it that in normal cases and in these kinds of cases that don't involve compromising the principle of procreative beneficence. The other thing that he points out is that in the embryo selection case, like the asthma case he started with, selecting embryos on the basis of their genes doesn't disadvantage that particular child in some way. Because if you select a different embryo, like a normal embryo that doesn't have these more advanced traits, then a different person altogether would have existed. So it's not like you're making the specific child worse off by selecting the embryo that has, better height genes or better intelligence genes or whatever it happens to be. You're not making that child worse off, because if you picked a different embryo, it would just be a totally different child that's born. The embryo has essentially two options: to be born with its current genetic set, or to just not be born at all and to simply remain an embryo, to remain a merely possible person rather than an actual person. So you're not disadvantaging a particular child with your choice of genetic selection if we're talking about an embryo in vitro fertilization type selection case. Different objection. Principle of procreative beneficence would promote inequality. Now I'm going to have a whole separate lecture on the reading tied to that objection, so I'm going to run through this kind of quickly. The concern, in a nutshell, is simply this. If you have people selecting for certain traits, what's going to happen over time is you're going to get a bunch of people who are genetically better off than the normal population, and that's going to make worse already existing inequalities or potentially create new inequalities. So here are some responses. First, Savulescu thinks that widespread selection based on certain traits, including, for example, biological sex, so it's well known that in a lot of societies in the world, you are at a significant advantage if you are male as opposed to being female. But if you had widespread selection based on sex, he thinks this would be unlikely to promote well-being, because you would get, you get a society where you have like a 3-to-1 ratio of men to women. That's not going to be a favorable society, particularly for men. It's going to break down a lot of... it's going to make it very hard for people to form, at least for the men involved, to form lasting familiar relationships, because heterosexuality is the overwhelmingly dominant sexual orientation. It's going to be very difficult in a society like that, with that kind of structure, for men to be really satisfied when they have such a difficult time finding romantic partners and starting families and forming meaningful relationships. The other thing he says is that institutional reform and other measures that have nothing to do with reproduction are better ways of addressing this kind of discrimination. So the background concern is the inequalities themselves, not the principle of procreative beneficence. So he thinks what you do is you try to engage in institutional reform. This is one of the points that Robert Sparrow is going to take him to task on. We'll get to that before too long. I'm just flagging that now, that this is actually, I think, a pretty weak response to this particular objection. Now here's the weird thing about Savulescu's position. At the very end of the article, he says that, well, first he recognizes, okay, damn it, we're just going to do this again. Now there's one weird thing that comes up at the end of this article. Savulescu, throughout this whole paper, is pushing this principle of procreative beneficence. And then we get to the very end of the article, and he acknowledges that there is a conflict between procreative beneficence and respecting parental autonomy, right? Because if you respect parental autonomy, then that means that you'd be allowing parents to violate procreative beneficence, right? And that seems problematic. So there's this question here: well, which principle wins out? What do we allow parents to choose whether or not they enhance their kids, so to speak, or do we say no, procreative beneficence is mandatory and we really should be doing what we can to encourage or perhaps even pressure parents into choosing the child with the best genes, the genes that are going to give them the best chance at living a good life? What he says is that in liberal democracies, there should be a presumption in favor of parental autonomy. And I just found this very odd, given how the article goes, because he even says earlier, if we backtrack a ways, he explicitly says that the principle of parental autonomy gets us the wrong verdict about the asthma case, because he doesn't think that the morally right thing to do in that case is to allow a person to select for the asthma gene. That seems reasonable, but so how do you reconcile what he says here? How is that verdict about the asthma case, how is that to be reconciled with this idea that we should just simply kind of presume to honor parental autonomy if we're living in a liberal democracy? I don't have a clean answer to this. I'm assuming that he addresses this in more depth in other works, because he does have a couple other articles where he talks about this particular issue. But this is just a weird puzzle. It's basically equivalent of saying the principle of procreative beneficence is the correct moral account of what parents ought to do, but they're within their rights to just completely ignore it. Now, there's not necessarily anything incoherent about that. There are certain other kinds of cases we can imagine where maybe that's the case. A lot of people think there's something wrong with viewing at least certain types of pornography, for instance, but think that on, say, grounds of personal privacy, you may well be within your rights to view that kind of sexually explicit content. But those are, is this really the same kind of case? I'm not sure. But it's an inconsistency that's worth wondering about. And again, this is something that Robert Sparrow kind of presses on towards especially in the second half of his critical article. So I think that's what we'll turn to next. Let's jump into some of Sparrow's stuff. Robert Sparrow, at least judging by the bulk of his work, is a bioconservative when it comes to issues related to human enhancement. This article is no exception. Main purpose of the article is to offer a bioconservative critique of Julian Savulescu's general position. Now, he also lumps in John Harris with sharing some of Savulescu's same ideas. Both of them have argued in favor of something akin to the principle of procreative beneficence. So he's tackling them both together. We haven't read anything by John Harris, but it's fair to put him and Savulescu in the same camp. Now, if you'll recall from our discussion of bioconservatism in connection with Michael Sandel's article, there are two broad types of bioconservative positions. There are, in principle, bioconservative views, which say that human enhancement is wrong, independent of any practical concerns about how it's implemented or what its implications would be. There are also practical critiques or in-practice critiques. This is an example of the latter. Sparrow's main objections to the principle of procreative beneficence focus on what it would mean to take that principle seriously, how it would play out in the real world, and the bad effects that would result from doing so. So most of his criticisms hinge on pointing out undesirable implications or consequences that would result from taking the principle of procreative beneficence seriously. So if we're trying to follow that principle, that means we want to ensure that our children have the best lives possible. And if we do that, we get into some uncomfortable questions. Here's one that he raises. Should we manipulate the neurotransmitters in our children's brains so that they simply feel better than they otherwise would? So if the goal is to make sure that they're as happy as possible, and happiness is, at least in part, how we feel from the inside out, why not just manipulate their neurotransmitters so that they're hopped up on serotonin and dopamine more than the average person, and they just feel good, feel better than ordinary people? Now, before I move on to this one, let me pause and make one observation. He makes an allusion here to Brave New World, which I believe we talked about in class in connection with mood enhancement, the use of the drug soma. This is very similar. This idea of manipulating neurotransmitters is very similar to the effect that's created in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World by the use of the drug soma. It essentially makes people feel really, really good, but it also kind of zombifies them. It makes them less aware of what's going on around them, less critical of the world in general, more optimistic, but they're sort of disconnected from reality in a way that's really jarring, and the way that the novel portrays it, not good. Like, it's not a good thing overall that they feel better about how their lives are going, because what they've essentially got is sort of like an imperfect substitute for real happiness. You know, they've got quasi happiness or diet happiness or something like that. They don't have real happiness. And so Sparrow's concerned about potentially being required, according to the principle of procreative beneficence, to create a similar effect on our children if we have the means to do so. But that's largely a minor point in his article. The main criticism has to do more with the second question, which is, should we try to avoid having children with identities that may make their lives go worse than they otherwise would? And identities here is understood to be very, very broad. So racial identity, gender identity or biological sex, sexual orientation, perhaps even just basic characteristics like hair color, eye color, those kinds of things. Now, I have a large block quote here from Sparrow's article. I think it's important to look at the actual text to see exactly how he's structuring his argument. So here's the first big quote. There will be another one on a subsequent slide. In many parts of the world today, prevailing social circumstances are likely to have a much greater impact on the welfare of individuals than other environmental factors. In a racist society, where children born with particular markers will have reduced life prospects, a proper concern for their well-being requires parents work to mitigate the impact of racism by altering the child's environment or by manipulating the genes associated with these markers, or both. So in layman's terms, what this means is, in reality, in our ordinary imperfect world, there are certain kinds of identities that are privileged over others. If you're a parent trying to mitigate the impact of those identities on your kid, you've basically got two ways of doing so. Either you change your kid's identity, or you change background social conditions. Here's why this matters. So what I've done on this slide is I've taken Sparrow's remarks from the quote from the previous slide, as well as a subsequent quote that follows that, and I've reconstructed it into an argument. This isn't maybe exactly how he might reconstruct it himself. This is how I understand it based on what the text says. So, first premise: certain traits usually make a person's life go worse because of current social conditions. These could be traits related to race, biological sex, your sexual orientation, could be other aspects of your identity, could just be your sort of general appearance, being too tall, being too short, being generally perceived as unattractive, stuff like that. Wide range of things. Could also be related to, say, your level of intelligence, your general kind of coordination. Doesn't have to be limited to just physical traits. But certain traits typically make a person's life go worse because of the way society is structured, because of background social conditions. Second premise: we can protect children from these outcomes by altering their genes to remove these traits, altering the current social conditions, or doing both of these things. So that's almost lifted almost verbatim from the quote on the previous slide. But, and this is the critical move, the critical observation he makes that's important to take account of, it will almost always be easier for parents to alter the genes of their children, if the technology is available to do so, than it would be to alter current social conditions. What this means in layman's terms is, if you're a parent and there's genetic modification technology available to you that's cheap and applicable to your child, it is going to be much easier for you to promote your child's well-being by using that technology than it would be to try to initiate some kind of social revolution in order to change the background social conditions, to get some kind of widespread cultural shift or something like that. Those kinds of movements are well beyond the means of any individual person to enact or facilitate. So if you're just an individual parent, or if you're a couple, you're not going to have the means of doing that. But you might have the means of making your individual child's life better. And so it would follow that parents should select against genes that lead to the development of these traits. Following the principle of procreative beneficence is going to lead you to do that, because that's going to be way, way more feasible for you to achieve than trying to alter the background structure of society. Now, may not be obvious, but that's actually a pretty troubling conclusion. It's going to get you some undesirable results. In a society where it is possible to genetically alter the traits that a child has, and where certain identities typically make a person's life go worse, the principle of procreative beneficence is going to have some really interesting consequences if we follow it to its logical conclusion. One of these is, we're generally going to want to select for certain races over others, because some races have a clear advantage, this is especially true in certain societies in the world, but even in a country like the United States, where we ostensibly recognize that all races should be treated equally as full citizens, have equal rights, be regarded equally under the law and all that, there are still structural inequalities that persist. The same is true for women. Being a woman in many respects is a disadvantage even in a society like the United States. We have made tremendous progress over the last 100 years with respect to equality of the races and equality of the sexes, but there's a lot of progress still to be made. So if you're thinking, I want a child that's going to have the best shot at having a good life, it's probably in your interest to, at least in the United States, to have a child that is male and a child that is white. If the more that you deviate from that particular identity, it seems like the more of a disadvantage overall your child is going to be at. Your child will also be disadvantaged if they are not heterosexual. So there may be a reason for, if possible, to select against genes that correlate with homosexuality, bisexuality, and other non-standard sexual orientations. There may also just be a more general requirement for you to select for other favored aesthetic qualities. So if you're in a society where blonde hair is generally the most popular and considered the most attractive, that may give you a reason to select for blonde hair, because being perceived as attractive generally makes it easier for you to form lasting relationships with other people, to be perceived favorably by other people, to avoid certain stigmas associated with unattractiveness. You can pretty quickly see, we could, by the way, keep going. There are other things that we could add on here. You might be required, for instance, to select for traits that have to do with a person's height or a person's weight or things like that. We could keep building this list out, but I don't think that's necessary to illustrate the general point. You can see pretty quickly that this is going to get us into some uncomfortable territory, where parents are now, they're suddenly all obligated to try to create children that, insofar as possible, mirror the dominant race, the dominant sex, the most favored sexual orientation, the most favored aesthetic qualities. We've got all of our parents seemingly being obligated, on the grounds of this principle of procreative beneficence, to generate children that are all very similar to one another, further, kind of marginalizing these identities that are already, because of background social conditions, perceived as disadvantageous. So what's going to happen is, if you have a bunch of parents following this principle of procreative beneficence, they're all going to be obligated to produce the same types of children. And if that happens, you're going to get a couple of predictable results. One is the population is going to become more homogeneous. Or in other words, the population is going to become less diverse. You're going to see more and more of the same types of people. Now, that might be problematic on its own, just insofar as having lots and lots of people that are similar to one another it tends to result in, kind of more, they might get along together more cohesively in some ways, but it also tends to sort of stagnate the development of new ideas, because everybody kind of, interacts and engages in a lot of the same types of activities or thinking. So that's one possible disadvantage, but the bigger disadvantage is that you're going to wind up with a society where existing groups that are already marginalized or disadvantaged in certain ways, they're just going to get more marginalized. Not only because their numbers will go down, their share of the population will decrease, but also because it's going to reinforce the idea that they are in some way undesirable, because you'd have this trend of parents selecting for particular identities that don't reflect their identities. And so eventually their identities would become even more stigmatized, because if you were, say, a parent who didn't choose, the blonde-haired, blue-eyed white male, or whatever the paradigmatic ideal child was, if you didn't use the genetic enhancement technology to create that child, there would be sort of an assumption that you had chosen a less than the best child for some reason, which you can see very quickly this is going to get us into some really uncomfortable territory, because we're going to wind up socially instantiating judgments about the quality of people based on, not on their character, not on things they've actually done, but based on their phenotypical characteristics, their race, their biological sex. We've done this, of course, historically. It always has really, really bad results. It leads to things like overt racism, systemic oppression, and just lots of suffering, of course, for the marginalized groups. It is just bad. This is not where we want to wind up. So we got to find a way to avoid this sort of outcome. So how do you avoid this outcome? Well, here's one proposal that Sparrow discusses in the article. He makes the observation that procreative beneficence has its unsavory implications, in large part because it's a type of maximizing consequentialism. Utilitarianism, to have a throwback to Unit 1, is also a type of maximizing consequentialism, and the premier, the dominant type of maximizing consequentialism. Maximizing consequentialist views they advocate producing the best possible outcome. What you're morally obligated to do on those theories is to pursue the action that's likely to have the best overall consequences. There is, however, an alternative conception of consequentialism that's not that extreme. It's called satisficing consequentialism. And this is how Sparrow defines it. It's a consequentialism according to which actions are justified only if they bring about a state of affairs that is good enough. So the idea behind satisficing consequentialism is that there is some kind of a threshold of what separates permissible outcomes from impermissible ones. And as long as the outcome that you're promoting is good enough to get above that threshold, however we're defining it, as long as it's above that threshold, it's permissible. It's something that's acceptable for you to do. So Sparrow's solution would be or at least a solution he considers, is we understand the principle of procreative beneficence as a satisficing standard, a standard of what makes parents. God damn it! I feel like I'm getting sick. So Sparrow's solution, or at least one solution he considers, is to understand procreative beneficence as a requirement that parents ensure their child has a good enough chance at a worthwhile life. Not necessarily the best chance, but a good enough chance. And if we do that, he thinks we can avoid the principle's unsavory implications. His proposed standard is normal human capacities. So if you adopted this kind of a standard, then you'd still have a good reason to select against certain kinds of disease genes, to try to avoid having a child that has Tay-Sachs disease or cystic fibrosis or a predisposition to asthma. Think back to Savulescu's case, or rubella, or whatever it is. But you would not have compelling moral reasons to favor a particular sexual identity, a particular biological sex, a particular race, or specific individual traits like hair color, eye color, whatever else. Instead, you would just be required as a parent to make sure that your child had at least met the threshold of having basic or normal human capacities. And that would be the extent of your obligation. He also makes an observation that I think is really important, which is ordinarily we never assume that parents are required, morally speaking, to promote the best possible outcome for their child. That would be incredibly onerous on parents, to require them to meet a standard that is that lofty. Instead, usually what we assume is that parents should prioritize the welfare of their children pretty highly in their lives, but it's not the only thing that they can prioritize. We don't assume that parents should just 24 hours a day, or at least all of their waking hours, be concerned with promoting their child's welfare. I mean, parents are allowed to still have hobbies that are unconnected to their children. They're still allowed to care about their jobs and to pursue work-related activities. They're still allowed to have friends and to engage in social activities with them. Parenthood is not a, abandonment of all of your individual interests in favor of your child's interests. So I think that this kind of proposal, understanding procreative beneficence as a more lax standard and not requiring us to produce the best child possible, I think there's a lot to be said for this. I think it's a pretty reasonable proposal. And that takes us to the end of this. I'm normally not, a lot of times in this course when we've talked about these kinds of articles, I've usually not kind of said what my overall view is, because a lot of times I think that there's something to be said on both sides. This is not the end of this discussion, but I definitely think that just comparing Savulescu's view and Sparrow's view, I really think that Sparrow has some pretty compelling criticisms of this principle of procreative beneficence. I think it would be very, very difficult, as Savulescu presents the principle originally, it's really, really difficult to think that that principle gets us the right answer to our kind of what our obligations as parents would be in a world where genetic enhancement is available. I think that trying to follow this principle to its logical conclusion gets us kind of terrifying results, and I also think it's just too demanding. It doesn't accurately track what typical obligations tied to parenthood are like. So I think Sparrow's got a pretty good critique. There may be some ways that Savulescu can respond. This isn't the only thing that he's written about this particular issue. So if you're thinking about working on this for term paper, that might be an interesting direction to go. See what else Savulescu has written about this subject. See if he's got any kind of good responses to some of the criticisms that Sparrow raises. Of course, Sparrow himself also has some other articles on this topic and on human enhancement more generally. So there's more stuff to dig into here, but this is where we will leave it for now.